I'm Dr. Nathaniel Chin, and you're listening to Dementia Matters, a podcast about Alzheimer's disease. Dementia Matters is a production of the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. Our goal is to educate listeners on the latest news in Alzheimer's disease research and caregiver strategies. Thanks for joining us. Welcome back to Dementia Matters. Artificial intelligence has been a fixture in the news this year, with fields ranging from tech to entertainment discussing how it can and should be used in their work. Healthcare is no different, with numerous studies looking into the ways it could be used to improve diagnoses and treatments of different diseases. This begs the question, how could AI and machine learning be used within Alzheimer's disease research and care? Well, to answer this question, I'm joined by Doctors Marina Sirota and Dr. Alice Tang. Dr. Sirota is a professor and acting director at the Baker Computational Health Sciences Institute at University of California, San Francisco, and the principal investigator at the Sirota Lab, which focuses on developing integrative computational methods for diagnosing and treating different diseases, with a particular focus on women's health. Dr. Alice Tang is a postdoctoral fellow at the Sirota Lab and an MD PhD student at University of California, San Francisco. In February 2024, they published a study examining how well AI could predict a person's risk of developing Alzheimer's disease based on information from electronic health records. Marina and Alice, welcome to Dementia Matters.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So to begin, what made you interested in conducting this study on Alzheimer's disease compared to the other diseases that the lab looks at?
So maybe I can start and say we started working in the field of Alzheimer's disease maybe 8 or so years ago. And we started with a number of molecular studies. We wanted to use data, mostly molecular data from the public domain, to understand whether we can identify new therapies or repurpose existing therapies for Alzheimer's disease from the molecular perspective. We've also been interested in studying sex differences in Alzheimer's. We know that Alzheimer's disease affects women disproportionately, and the disease manifests itself quite differently in men and women. So we wanted to explore that from the molecular perspective first. So then Alice joined my lab in 2020 in the middle of COVID, and she was interested in exploring electronic medical records. Since we've had several ongoing Alzheimer's projects in the lab, this was one of our first forays into leveraging electronic medical records to better understand what does the disease population look like in Alzheimer's and how the disease might be different in men and women. We started with some association studies, and then we moved on to applications of AI and predictive modeling.
It's so incredible that the work has been going on for years, and then you're really marrying the ideas of your interests in Alzheimer's and its particular impact on women. And then Alice comes along with her interest in electronic health records. And so then, Alice, I have a question for you, which is why use electronic health records? What was it about that intrigued you compared to the other data that you might have access to?
Yeah, of course. So, as Marina mentioned, when I entered the lab, there were a lot of ongoing studies in Alzheimer's disease looking at molecular data sets that were publicly available to investigate not only drugs, but also differences in men and women. And at the time I joined in 2020, the electronic health record was starting to kind of explode as an interesting data source that could be utilized. And one of the benefits of electronic health record is that we have data that's passively collected over many years. And one of the difficult things of a lot of public data sets that are available in dementia is that it may be limited in the amount of years that is represented. And the other thing too is a lot of these data sets may have a very well predefined cohort. But electronic health records, we can kind of come across it with our own questions and define our own cohorts and look at dementia more broadly.
It really is the perfect symbol of research and clinical care coming together, though, isn't it? And it's really exciting what you found. And so, for whoever wants to answer this question, can you briefly explain for our listeners what you actually did in the study And I'm going to give you the caveat that not all of us are experts in computational science. So, in your answer, can you also explain what I read about, which is random forest algorithms, and how that's different from other AI technology like ChatGPT, which I think our listeners are probably more familiar with?
So I'm happy to start and then I can turn it over to Alice maybe. So I want to step back and talk a little bit about data science and the type of computational work that we do more broadly. What we do in the lab is we try to take data, whether it's molecular data, such as, let's say, gene expression, which genes are turned on and which genes are turned off, or microbiome data, which microbes are present in a sample, or genetics data, proteomics, all of these are molecular measures, or clinical data. This is information, all the information that gets captured when somebody goes to see a clinician. And we need to recognize this data is not collected for research purposes. Actually, they're collected for billing purposes. But we can use these data either separately or together in interesting ways to inform therapeutic and diagnostic strategies and to ask questions about disease. So in our lab, we take this data, whatever that data might be, and we try to turn it into knowledge. From the computational perspective, there's different ways of doing that. We can go with statistical approaches, trying to figure out what's signal and what's noise using more, I would say, traditional data science and statistics. We can use predictive modeling, which is I would refer to as classical AI. Random forest is an example of such, to identify patients at risk for something, or maybe to predict a therapeutic strategy. In this case, we're talking about risk prediction. And there are newer approaches that we refer to as generative AI, such as ChatGPT, which actually generate new information based on information they already have now. The work that we're going to focus on today is that middle predictive modeling aspect of things. And I'll turn it over to Alice to describe the study.
So, in our study, going off of what Marina was talking about, we wanted to use these electronic health records and see what kind of knowledge we can gain from electronic health records. And this is also building off of some of our prior studies looking at broader associations between men and women, but without having that perspective of the timing of these associations. We had two applications going into this. And I think also talking about the applications, it also helps to understand the field of others doing predictive modeling in Alzheimer's disease as well. So, one of our goals is the application component. Can we predict Alzheimer's disease far in advance? As I mentioned, one of the benefits for electronic health record is longitudinal data. We have data at least a decade or more since around 2009, 2010, hospitals around the United States started to adopt electronic health records. So that is already data that we wanted to be able to leverage to capture potential conversion to Alzheimer's disease. The other thing is that this is building a model to predict Alzheimer's disease risk in advance using data years before an Alzheimer's disease diagnosis. Some of the other predictive models in the literature in the field are based on, say, neuroimaging or neuropsychiatric scores. And I see this as present day classification. So you already have a symptom. Now, what do you have potentially? What is a disease that you might have? And there are other models too, such as prognosis. How fast will you progress? So, as Marina mentioned, our first application is using this data that's just routinely collected. Can we predict Alzheimer's disease? And then the second part is interpretation. So we mentioned using electronic health record, and actually in the lab, we were interested in all data sets. We wanted to use all data sets, but it was really hard to find a sample or a data set where you have not only clinical data, but molecular data and imaging data on the same patients. So what we actually ended up doing was, from interpretation standpoint, we used human data to identify possible connections with Alzheimer's disease and use something called a knowledge network, which I think of as a huge database that combines information we know from prior literature and prior studies to see what are some shared molecular pathways. And we use molecular data sets to try and validate some of the potential molecular associations that we found from human data.
And one of the questions that I have, and I will say that what's interesting about both of your answers in the way you describe the different modes of computational science, it actually sounds very similar to me the way I hear biomarker scientists talking about biomarkers. There's different purposes, predictive value, identification, and it is incredible the overlap that exists there. But when you talk about the power of this longitudinal data, it makes so much sense that you're combining these different sources, trying to predict something. But I think for a lot of our listeners, who most of which have gone into healthcare and had their doctor examine them, what data though are you actually looking at in the electronic health record, and like what data is being put into these algorithms to generate your predictive values?
So, for an electronic health record, one thing that I think is a benefit is that this is routinely collected healthcare data. So, it's not yet at a point where we're acquiring biomarkers or doing images on patients. So, in terms of application, I see it more as in a primary care context where we want to screen people that might be at risk and may need a referral to a neurologist. So, in terms of the data, that is mainly what exists in electronic health records. So, billing codes that represent diagnoses, such as hypertension or hyperlipidemia or broken bone. So, some of these are billing codes that a clinician may put down after every visit with a patient. And besides diagnoses, we have medications that a physician may prescribe to a patient, and we have lab tests. And specifically, we looked at abnormal lab tests. And beyond that, we also have demographic information and information about hospital utilization as well. So we use all of this readily available data to put into the models as a first step to make that determination on whether someone may need a referral or be at risk.
So I wanted to comment on the data. I wanted to say that this is the beginning. We're starting with these structured data sets, but there's more in the electronic record. You can imagine also analyzing clinical notes or images or radiology reports. All of those could also inform potentially predictive models in the future. We here started both in terms of our association studies as well as predictive modeling with the structured data out of the electronic medical record.
I'll go on top of that to also say that the interest in real world data and electronic health record data is exploding, but there are also limitations that we are trying to figure out how to overcome. One of which is that this data is incredibly messy and there's a lot of potential for missingness as well. So, a lot of what we did in representing this data is thinking about how, if, say, you have a single patient visit, you might think of their diagnoses as a binary, whether they have hypertension or not. So, in our initial models, we didn't take time into account other than the fact that it existed before their visit.
It's an incredible amount of data that goes into the electronic health record. So it's fortunate that it's a computer that's analyzing it, because it's just overwhelming to think about as someone who enters data in on my patients. I can't imagine wanting to look at a whole slew of it. But now we're at the exciting part where I'm going to ask you, what did your study actually find? And then how accurate was this AI technology that you guys were using?
In terms of the predictive accuracy, when building a machine learning model, we also need a reference in which the model can learn from. And that reference is important since even the word Alzheimer's disease has been an evolving word that has been applied differently over time as well. So we actually had colleagues at the Memory Aging Center here at UCSF where they had an internal database with Alzheimer's disease diagnosis based on expert neurologist diagnosis. So we use that as our reference labels to define our patient population. And we also determined the first onset of Alzheimer's disease based on potential symptoms or first evidence of a disease. So, for example, some patients were prescribed medications for dementia before a billing code for dementia was given, such as donepezil or memantine. we use that as our indicator of a first instance of dementia. Some patients also may have vascular dementia before they get diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. So we were also careful about how we defined the onset of dementia. And then from that, we identify controls that don't have dementia, but use their last visit as a way to identify their time of a positive or a similar time of some onset. And from that, we build our prediction models using all available patients that we can in the electronic health records with at least 7 years of data. From that, as you mentioned, we obtain about 70%. I would say accuracy is not the most accurate word, but it's the most potentially wide reaching word. We used a metric that actually looked at a variety of scores, such as, say, if you take a COVID antigen test at home, you have to determine how dark of your line do you consider that to be a positive score. So the score actually looks through this various levels of how dark that line is and gives an accuracy measure, which is around 70%, which is considered better than chance and pretty decent. And the reason why we use this too is that it does take into account data imbalance. Since if we have a rare disease, for example, if only 1% of the population has a disease, then a model that always says yes will be 99% accurate. So that's why, while accuracy is not the best word, it is the most, I would say, wide-reaching word we can use. And that this is based on all of the patients that we were able to use an electronic health record.
And I appreciate you giving the limitations and the messiness of the data, but it still is pretty impressive to have a 70% accuracy at predicting something 7 years in advance. And as I read through the article, I mean, it was even 80% at 1 year. And I know 1 year is a shorter interval, but this is without even meeting a person. Your algorithm is able to give such decent accuracy at this. But you guys also talked about other factors that really would influence or affect that accuracy. And can you go over some of those that you were considering?
Absolutely. So I can jump in. I would say almost probably as interesting as the accuracy of the models themselves is being able to understand and look at the interpretation and why these models are predicting certain individuals as high risk for Alzheimer's. And I guess that is also one of the reasons why we ended up moving forward with a random forest model for this analysis, because that model is so interpretable and easy to understand in terms of the features that come out. So, looking broadly, there were a number of features that were common across the different models that we explored. And those included hyperlipidemia, congestive heart failure, colon neoplasm. These are all general features that were associated with Alzheimer's disease. However, we also, and by we I mean Alice, carried out the work looking at male and female specific models to understand some of the sex differences. And here we saw something very interesting. We saw that there were a number of features that were male enriched, such as chest pain, erectile dysfunction, and other conditions. And then there were specific features that were enriched in women. And these included one that was specifically interesting to us, osteoporosis.
So I'll jump in by also taking one step back, which is that for in terms of these really great performing models, some other features too we saw that were very predictive were things that were actually obvious and expected, such as age. We know in the field that age is one of the biggest predictors for Alzheimer's disease or one of the biggest risks. And some of our initial models, we saw a lot of conditions that come up that we think may be associated with age, like hypertension. Then going into some of the findings Marina mentioned, to improve interpretability, we actually made it a harder problem for the model, which is now we found patients of similar age and asked the model, for these two patients, what is their risk? And that is where we identified all of these other conditions that pop up. So actually, we saw conditions like hypertension become less predictive. And we were like, potentially that's because it is a disease that is associated with age as well. And there are some publications even showing that hypertension in early life and hypotension in later life, that there is this fluctuation in blood pressure and potentially getting blood throughout the body that could also relate to risk of Alzheimer's disease. And in some of our models where we matched by age and we looked in between sex differences, we do see some cardiovascular risk factors, such as congestive heart failure and even erectile dysfunction as being a potential marker for vascular dysfunction among males. But it's interesting too to see how this vascular dysfunction might look different between males and females. And that is also what our sex specific models seem to help tell us. Besides that, we also saw a lot of musculoskeletal conditions among females. So, osteoporosis, as Marina mentioned, that was one factor we saw that was actually predictive for females, but not as predictive for males.
And do you guys have a theory or a hypothesis as to what these different findings would mean? Because it seems to be pretty profound, but why?
In terms of theorizing about this predictiveness, it's not that we don't think osteoporosis is not predictive for males, but the time frame at which males may get osteoporosis may look different from females. In that females who have osteoporosis earlier on may have greater predictability of Alzheimer's disease diagnosis. But since this is also a predictive model, it's also not causal. That doesn't mean having osteoporosis causes Alzheimer's disease. But potentially that might suggest there are some underlying factors that leads to osteoporosis as one of the initial manifestations that could lead to Alzheimer's disease down the line. And the other thing to mention too is that our model takes in multiple comorbidities. It's not that osteoporosis alone leads to Alzheimer's disease, but osteoporosis plus a couple other combination of comorbidities that leads to an Alzheimer's disease prediction.
But that's what's so powerful is that human beings are not written in textbooks, right? We have multiple diseases, we have multiple factors, and your model's really able to account for that. And so it's more real world. I mean, it's real world data, but it's a real world applicability. And I think for me, what's fascinating is that while you have a predictive model that you're looking to see, well, what is the chance of developing dementia or Alzheimer's disease, you are also, in a way, trying to look at the mechanisms, the biology that could be leading to these diseases. And we still are trying to understand why is it that Alzheimer's forms in some people and not others. And so just to hear that we know there's a sex difference and we're not fully understanding why, but your predictive model might be putting a spotlight on something that we hadn't considered before. And so it's pretty powerful to think that this could lead to other studies that maybe show some sort of relationship that we hadn't yet considered.
So I want to piggyback on that and say absolutely. And it's also very interesting to us that multiple levels of evidence are allowing us to arrive at this conclusion. So these are all models, as you know, that are built on electronic medical records, clinical real world data. But what Alice has done with the top predictors are two additional analyses. One is these data, the data that are input to the models, are data from UCSF. We also have access to clinical records across the whole UC system. That's including UCSD, UC Irvine, UCLA, etc. So what Alice did is for two examples, for hyperlipidemia and for osteoporosis, she queried the data across the whole UC system, taking UCSF out of the picture, of course, and wanted to see, do these relationships hold up? And we saw that hyperlipidemia indeed was significantly associated with further development of Alzheimer's. And this was true in both men and women. But for osteoporosis, that relationship existed, but only for females. So that tells you that now across several independent clinical centers, we're able to observe this interesting relationship. The second aspect is understanding, potentially, like you were alluding to, the mechanism. And this came with a collaboration with Sergio Baronzini, who's another faculty member at UCSF and has developed Spoke. Spoke is a knowledge network. It's a network of networks that has thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of nodes, where those nodes can be drugs, genes, diseases, you name it. And this is a way to capture existing knowledge across many, many different databases. So, what Alice has done is she's taken the 25 top predictive features across all the machine learning models that she's run and layered spoke on top of that. So then we can see potential molecular relationships that might be present between Alzheimer's and osteoporosis that people might not have explored. This is a way to generate hypotheses. And this has allowed us to zero in on some immune signals that are incredibly, incredibly interesting. And then further, Alice validated them using independent genetics data.
So the genetics data set we looked at was other genetic studies that people have published where they have genetic variant data and clinical phenotype data. So we did something called genetic colocalization analysis, where we have traits of people, such as an Alzheimer's disease diagnosis or their heel bone mineral density. The UK Biobank is one example data set with phenotypes and genetic variant data. And then we looked at, are there certain variants that are associated with both of these traits? And we did find a variant that was in chromosome 11, close to the MS4A family, that seemed to be associated with both Alzheimer's disease and low heel bone mineral density. And this also held up with the trait of MS4A 6A expression in the blood based on some RNA-seq data sets that we were able to identify. So this potentially, as Marina mentioned, using human data to generate hypotheses and then looking at an independent data set, we can see maybe there is a relationship that can be explained from a molecular standpoint, such as through the MS4A family. And from what we know about MS4A6A, it encodes a transmembrane tetraspan protein that's expressed in both peripheral immune cells as well as microglia in the cerebral spinal fluid. And based also on some of the signals we see in the knowledge network that point at immune signaling, we hypothesize there might be some connection between the immune system and MS4A6A expression or its variants and its risk in females for both osteoporosis and Alzheimer's disease. So that's one way in which we try to attain knowledge from starting from human data to a hypothesis and looking at independent data sets. But I think one other lesson I also want to mention is that this relationship we know is, while it exists in females, there are many other associations that we didn't explore as in-depth that we saw in our data set. And I think that too tells you about the heterogeneity of Alzheimer's disease and how when you have a machine learning model, it tries to take all of that into account. But even when we stratify by sex, we see that some of the predictors start to change in importance. And when you think about these machine learning models just more broadly, that means that, machine learning takes all of these into account, but sometimes these individual factors may be different between populations.
It's just such an incredible treasure trove of information, and I can see the two of you as you're talking. There's so many different pathways you could go with what you're finding. And so I guess one of my questions as we wrap up today is how soon would you say these kinds of models would be integrated into regular clinic or research settings in other places? What really needs to be done, if anything, to improve them so that other people are doing this as well?
So I'm happy to start. There's several things that need to happen before a model like this can be implemented. While we validated several of the independent associations, we have not validated the models comprehensively and explored them in an independent clinical system fully. So I think for the model progression aspect, that's one. The second is the so what. So let's say we can identify somebody at high risk for Alzheimer's 7 years before. What can be done? Is this useful information to the clinician? How will it impact what happens to that patient across those 7 years? So, this is something that we think about a lot, both in terms of discovering or trying to identify new therapies, and also maybe some lifestyle factors. And of course, many people around the country and the world are working on these problems. So those are the two things that I can think of in terms of the next steps in terms of model implementation. But there are also next steps to think about in the context of the biology that we were able to find, the link between osteoporosis and Alzheimer's in women and this MS4A6A family? Can that be a therapeutic? Can we explore the biology? Should we be launching animal studies to understand that relationship better? So I think of it as a way to generate hypotheses. And really, here, the world is your oyster. There's so much we can ask. And this is just one relationship out of all of the features that were identified. And of course, we can look at other things as well.
And to also piggyback on that, since I am currently doing my clinical training, I also think a lot about what does it look like if I apply this model to the patients in front of me? What does this look like if my grandmother comes home and her physician says they got a score in this model? So I think about that too. And I think, as Marina mentioned, one of the steps is validation of this model in itself. And not just validating that it works, but where does it work? Does it work only in California, or can it work elsewhere as well? Do we want to try and, modify it depending on location or the population? And then do clinicians, are they interested in this model, especially with all of the interest in AI nowadays, and in speaking with electronic health record companies and many companies out there, there's going to be more and more models that clinicians will be exposed to in the future. And I think about some of the models that do exist in clinical use now, such as the CHADS-VASc score for determining anticoagulation for atrial fibrillation. And to me, I think we want a model that's not only validated, but is also interpretable. And that's one of the reasons why we want to be able to see why a model gives us a prediction. So for a clinician, if they see that there is a certain score, first, it has to be somehow part of the workflow, and it has to make sense that we want to screen the patient in that point in time. But if it comes up, then why? If the top reasons are because of hyperlipidemia or because of osteoporosis, then that can help increase trust in that model. And from that, we can start asking, now what? Do you try to enroll them in some of these therapies that are currently used for Alzheimer's disease? Or do we worry that if they're asymptomatic, we don't want to expose them to a drug that can also potentially cause side effects? Or do we want to refer them to neurology? And I think that's a possibility too, that there's these sequential models where you now refer them to neurology, and there's further tests like imaging, biomarkers. And now these tests can also be incorporated back into the model to update potentially a risk score, or update a differential of the dementia, or what the biology might be underneath. And I think potentially that combination of models, however it might look like, however it might be validated, might end up helping with clinical care in the future, all the way to now they have the diagnosis, how do we best care for them so that they can continue living as happily and as cognitively in their best state as possible?
Well, as true scientists, you answered my one question with multiple other questions that need to be explored. And I will say, I thought it was interesting that, Marina, you said, so what? And then Alice, you said, now what? And these are really important questions. And I certainly do think there is going to be clinical utility to this, but I guess we're going to have to wait and see for what you guys produce. But with that, I'd like to thank you for being on Dementia Matters. And I certainly hope to have you on again after you have other studies out.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much. It's our pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Dementia Matters. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Or tell your smart speaker to play the Dementia Matters podcast. Please rate us on your favorite podcast app. It helps other people find our show and lets us know how we're doing. If you enjoy our show and want to support our work, consider making a gift to the Dementia Matters Fund through the UW Initiative to End Alzheimer's. All donations go toward outreach and production. Donate at the link in the description. Dementia Matters is brought to you by the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It receives funding from private, university, state, and national sources, including a grant from the National Institutes on Aging for Alzheimer's Disease Research. This episode of Dementia Matters was produced by Amy Lambright Murphy and Kaylin Rauerdink and edited by Eli Gadbury. Our musical jingle is Cases to Rest by Blue Dot Sessions. To learn more about the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, check out our website at adrc.wisc.edu. That's adrc.wisc.edu. And follow us on Facebook and Twitter. If you have any questions or comments, email us at dementiamatters@medicine.wisc.edu. Thanks for listening.